Hey everyone, and welcome back to the MD Investor Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Butler, and I'd like to welcome you back. Hopefully you're enjoying the content, and if you do, please feel free to like and subscribe and hit the little bell notification so whenever we do put out the podcast, you'd be able to be updated on that information. So the plan is to have the podcast come out on a regular Monday-like schedule. Today, what I want to really talk about is I noticed that a few episodes ago, I brought up the 6 core principles of financial literacy. However, I didn't really dive into those principles, and I'd like to talk to you guys about it now, mostly because those 6 core principles truly do matter in terms of setting up and understanding the difference between where you can be financially and where you currently are. Now, some of you might say, well, Doc, I'm financially literate. I know what I'm doing. I make good money. I'm not struggling. That's fantastic. But that puts you in the realm of a small percentage of people who don't need assistance. And there's a larger percentage of people who do. Even more so in the healthcare community, there are a lot of people who still do need a lot of help, and that's who I'm here for. Now, in terms of financial literacy, if you go to the Federal Reserve, what they do is they have surveys that they do every few years. And the way that they keep this information is based on questions about financial literacy. And a lot of people aren't able to answer some of the most basic questions about financial literacy. About 34% of people can successfully pass and show competence with financial literacy, and a lot of people do not. So what I want to do is go over the 6 core principles of financial literacy in this episode, so that way people can get a basic understanding of what I'm referring to. Because before we talk about investing and getting a lot deeper into how to create passive income and how to create a cash flow based system, you have to understand where your money should be going. So I'm going to also be using my cloth to keep myself dry. It is extremely hot and sweaty out here, so that's that. So in this case, let's talk about the 6 core principles. Those core principles are, we have to talk about earning, spending, saving, borrowing, investing, and protecting. So I typically like them in that order as well. So not just because those are the 6 core principles, but in that actual order. So let's start off by talking about earning. So for the most part, if you're listening to this podcast and you're either a friend of mine or if you're in the medical field in the first place, then what you're earning is based on what you're actually putting out. And what I mean by actually putting out is you're working as a physician or a nurse or a police officer or firefighter. Your career is what you're earning based off of. So either you can be a salaried employee, a W-2 employee, a W-4 or 1099 employee, whatever it may be. You physically have to go out and do something in order to bring in money into this category. So if you're familiar with health terms, this is kind of like your I's and O's, okay? So understanding your I's and O's is extremely important, and a lot of people don't actually take the time to break it down. So what are you actually physically bringing into your bank account, or what are you bringing into your living expenses on a regular basis? So that means when you're going out and you're working, how much are you bringing in either per hour or per month or per week? If you actually break this down, like truly break it down, it will give you an idea of what your time is worth and how much you value it. So for example, let's say you do work as a physician and you have a salary and you're making, $250 a year, or you're making $260 a year, or you're making $300,000 a year, or if you're a GI specialist or cardiologist, maybe you're making $1 million a year, whatever it is. However much you're making, that's not the point. The point is understanding when it's coming in and how much of your time that money is worth. In this case, it gets to the point where no matter what the number is, it might not be worth your time at one point or another. For example, let's say you do GI, and if the medical insurance reimbursements for GI comes down to being, let's say $200 per every case that you do when you're doing a colonoscopy. If you're doing 4, 5, 6, 7 cases a day, then let's say you have one day where you're only booked for 2 cases. It would be cheaper to cancel those 2 cases and reschedule them to where you have a more full day Like it wouldn't be worth the time to go into work to see 2 people and then to be done versus having a schedule where you see, your 7 to 8 patients or whatever your regular base schedule would be. So that's what I want you to understand is how much you're earning is going to dictate how much time you're spending. Because what most people don't realize is that earning is essentially what you're trading your life value and your time for. So if your salary is $250,000 a year, that means to the hospital, you have to be worth at least 10 times that amount, which means that your value is around $3 million. Because when you're talking about being an employer versus being an employee, you're looking for about a factor of 10 for what you're paying out for the work that you're getting in return. And that's fairly standard. So again, that's about what you're expecting no matter what field it is. So for example, if you worked at McDonald's, if you're making $12 an hour working at McDonald's, you're the owner of that franchise should be making about $120 per hour off of you, if that makes sense. So that's the goal. You want to kind of keep that ratio. So this means that if you own a hospital or you're hiring physicians, usually you're in that kind of ballpark, if not more. Obviously, the higher it is, the better it is. But in this case, we're going off of it being from a physician's standpoint. So let's say you are making $250,000 per year. Are you accounting for everything that's coming in? Because if you're a salaried employee, that means that you're more than likely paying for your health benefits, you're paying for taxes. All these things are going to be taking out of your earnings. So we want to really factor that in. You want to check your bank statements. You want to actually get an idea of the amount that's flowing in on a monthly basis. Then take that monthly basis and break it down to a weekly basis, and then from a weekly basis to a daily basis. Because if you want to know how to scale and move to the next level, you have to understand what's coming into the earnings section. The next section we're going to talk about is the outcome section, or the spending. So this is the O's from your I's and O's. How you're spending is going to dictate how you actually move to the next level. So if you're spending everything that's coming in on some form of your lifestyle, then you're going to have a really hard time moving to the next level where you want to become financially free, where you're not obligated to work all the time. If you're in a boat to where, let's say, for example, you don't have a breakdown to where you know where your money is supposed to go and how much you are supposed to spend, if your money is not previously allocated to some form or task for you, then in this case, it will be spent frivolously. And if it is done that way, then you will always continue to struggle. And I have a lot of friends who do work paycheck to paycheck, and they are physicians, and this isn't like a slight or anything of that nature. However, it is very hard to keep up with how the world works. There's lots of inflation. There's complex issues in terms of like where money needs to go. So just living expenses alone versus like if you rent or if you own. Because if you own, you have other issues to deal with. Maybe you have to deal with PMI, or maybe you have a physician loan for your home, or maybe you have a fixed or conventional loan. There's always going to be slight differences between everyone, because again, when it comes to finances, we're talking about personal finances. So these are the 6 core principles of personal finance. So personally, you're going to have to distinguish what's important to you, what works for you, and what fits to your situation. But when it comes to spending, you really have to know what's coming out. There's a reason that people give you bank statements, right? All the banks give you bank statements. The credit cards give you credit card statements. I check all of my accounts on a daily basis. So in this case, there's a reason for that. And it's because I want to build up habits to where I know what's coming in, what's going out, and why. And I suggest everyone do the same. There's people who do it every other day. There's people who do it once a week. But I check my accounts on a daily basis. Do I expect things to change on a daily basis? Not really. But I always want to know. I want to know, hey, I expected this much to be in that account and now it's gone. Because when an opportunity arrives, I need to be able to strike on that opportunity. Perhaps an opportunity for a new complex to purchase comes up in terms of real estate, or maybe an opportunity in the stock market opens up and I want to put more money towards a certain investment, whether it's long-term, short-term, whatever it may be. But that opportunity can only be utilized if I plan ahead of time for it. And I can only plan ahead of time unless I can't plan ahead of time unless I actually know what I have to utilize in that space. So this is where the idea of budgeting comes in and your banking system comes in place, because between earning and spending, you have to have a set banking structure in place. Everything should not be sitting in one account. And for the most part, I don't really utilize banks very heavily unless it's for a business venture where I need money to sit and actually accumulate for a few months at a time so I can build up a rapport. Maybe like for a lender and they say, hey, show me 3 months of bank statements because I'm making a purchase. But for my personal aspect of things, I don't really typically keep things in the bank. I don't have a reason to, because that's just for when I'm paying bills or something of that nature. In terms of where I save or allocate wealth, it'll never be in that location. I could either put it in bricks, I could put it in stocks, I could put it into assets, but I won't leave it in the bank because the bank's not going to pay me to hold my money, but they will charge me to give me my money back. And a lot of people don't see that gap. And that gap is something that if everyone was aware of that, probably would not be okay with leaving their money in the bank long term. The next aspect of everything is saving. So savings is meant to only be for two typical occasions. At least this is how I see it. Emergency funds, that's one. You should have an emergency fund that covers about 2 to 3 months of all of your basic living expenses. For any reason, if you were to get hurt, you were to get injured, and you could not use your regular income salary for some reason. Let's say you were hurt and you can't work for a few months. You broke your leg, you broke your arm. Most of the times in a physician's base employee, you still would go to work. Like you would go to work with like a little rascal scooter, or you would go to work in a sling. It wouldn't really stop you. But let's say, for example, you're a firefighter or a police officer. Now you can't go to work. It'd be very difficult to go fight fires or to go do active police work when you're injured. And for that reason, you should have an emergency fund. And again, everything that you have in terms of your expenses, what it costs to live, what your mortgage costs, what your lights cost, what your gas costs, what your Netflix and Hulu subscriptions cost. Because everyone knows that you have more than one. You don't have just Netflix or just Hulu. You probably have both. And if you have kids, you probably have Disney Plus or whatever it may be. How much are all these things costing? So if you get hurt, you shouldn't be struggling. You should have these things covered. So the emergency fund is just to cover those funds. The other thing is short-term savings goal. That goal is for a purchase. Maybe you want to buy a house, maybe you want to buy a car, or maybe you're aiming for a project. Your money should be saved in a separate account just for this. And again, how do you know how much you have to save on a regular basis? Can you save $50? Can you save $100? Can you save $5,000? It really depends on understanding your I's and O's. So the amount of money that you're bringing in, if you're like, hey, I'm a physician, I bring in, 14 grand every 2 weeks. Fantastic. So you're bringing in 28,000 every month after taxes or before tax. I don't know, whatever it is that you're bringing in. If you're saying your living expenses are equating to 20,000, then 8,000 are extra, right? Or vice versa. Or what if your living expenses come up to 28,000? Then it's like now you have to greatly overhaul what's happening, because everything you're spending shouldn't be everything that you're living off of, because that means that your debt to income ratio is way too high and it has to be fixed and addressed sooner than later. Because pretending sometimes that it's not a problem just leads to a bigger problem. If you notice there's a hole in your bucket, don't sit there and try to keep taping and repairing the bucket. Throw the bucket out, get a new bucket. This is how you have to actually approach things from a business and efficiency standpoint. Because if you try to pretend, you'll never actually get to the point where you stop having a leaky bucket, okay? The next thing is so again, we're not diving super, super deep. This is like kind of still surface level information. But again, the majority of people, again, 34% of people know this information back and forward. But the rest of us, if you're not in that 34% or that elite percentage of people who have their money down packed, then you're not in that category, then this information does matter. So after you're done saving, the next is borrowing. I say borrowing because borrowing is a place where it can actually create a catastrophe, or it can create wealth and freedom with leverage, but it has to be done properly. Now, everybody in the world borrows, but only a very few percentage of people borrow correctly. And what I mean by that is, if you have a credit card, that's borrowing. If you have a car and it's not paid off, you're borrowing. If you have a mortgage, which means there's a lender and someone's holding it because it's not paid off for the next 30 years with the conventional loan or a 15-year fixed or whatever it may be, if that money is coming from somewhere other than your own pocket, you're borrowing. And borrowing is perfectly fine. That's how our society works. We're capitalistic. Because you're borrowing, there's interest. And because there's interest, that means that someone is making profit from that. And that's perfectly fine for someone to make profit off of that. However, you do not want someone to make profit off of something that puts you further in debt without it being something that you can utilize properly. So let me give you an example. If you borrow and you have a house and it's a single family house and you're house rich, which means you have a very nice home. However, you might be over leveraged. Like, for example, there are rules to how you should budget. Some people follow, what do you say? The 50-30-20 rule. Yeah, the 50-30-20 rule. Like, you shouldn't live and have your regular expenses greater than 50%. 30% is what you do for leisure, and then 20% has to be saved. So if you follow this 50-30-20 rule, for example, then nothing that you have in your home or none of your fixed mandatory expenses should ever exceed 50% of what you're bringing in. So some people are house wealthy. Like, if you have a $200,000 salary, but you live in a home, and that home is $1.8 million or $2 million house, something of that nature, you're severely over leveraged at this point in time, which means that your regular expenses are going to exceed that 50%. And if you're exceeding the 50%, then you have to take something from somewhere else. Maybe you have to cut back on leisure and you live more frugally. If that's the case, then that's fine, but are you still saving 20%? Or maybe you're living off of 70% and then you have 30% for leisure, but now you have nothing for saving, nothing for investing, and nothing for the future, but you're taking care of right now. And that's also quite dangerous boat to live in. And a lot of actual physicians do live in that boat. They might be closer to the 70%, where 70% of their earnings and income is used on how their lifestyle works, and 30% might be going to leisure, and they're not really saving for the future. They don't have their retirement set up. They don't have either a 401k or an I or whatever it might be. They don't have that system in place. And if that's the case, that's a dangerous boat. But again, when you're borrowing can also lead to great amounts of wealth. So if you're borrowing, let's say you take a same 30-year loan, but in this case you buy a fourplex or an apartment complex, something that is cash flowing. Now after 30 years, who is paying all of that interest? The interest on anything that you're paying will always be irrelevant if someone else is paying it. And a lot of people miss that fact. The interest on whatever you're paying will always be irrelevant if someone else is paying it. So if I own vending machines and I'm like, for example, I have 3 or 4 vending machines, and if those vending machines are being paid for by people who are using the vending machines, then the interest rate is irrelevant. Or with trucks, let's say the trucks are at, 9% or 10%. However, I am renting out the truck, or I'm selling the truck, or my drivers are bringing in money for the trucks. The interest is irrelevant as long as someone else is paying it. So whatever venture you're into, as long as you're borrowing for someone else to pass the debt forward, then you will be successful in that borrowing venture. So again, I do have cars that are being rented out. Those cars are being paid for by someone else. So now in terms of my own personal vehicle, I still have a Nissan Rogue. It's an old car, but it's paid for. So I noticed that I've had this car for a very long time. Most of the time it just sits in the driveway. Even my neighbor has a very nice Porsche 911. It is a beautiful car. It's fantastic looking. It's in his driveway or his garage 95% of the time. He very rarely takes it out. He spends more time cleaning it and making it look fantastic than he actually spends driving it. So something of that nature is just a liability. So if you have an extremely nice car, you're like, oh, this is my brand new Tesla, or this is my brand new Mercedes, and it sits in the driveway most of the time, then it's not really something that's worth borrowing for. Does that make sense? Because you're going to be paying interest. You're going to end up having a car that costs you a lot more than it's beneficial for. Okay? So in this case, we might have to break this up into 2 episodes, because as of now, the current episode, we're only managed to get up to borrowing. So we still have to talk about investing, which again, I am the MD investor, which is the aspect of financial literacy that I like to focus on. We still have to talk about protecting. But borrowing does need a little bit more love. And the reason is because a lot of people focus on this area. And again, the Federal Reserve and their their institutional studies will show that a lot of people on a common household have a ton of debt. And they have a lot of retail debt and consumerism debt. So like a lot of people will go to Best Buy, or they'll go to one of these higher end stores, or not higher end, it could be Target or Walmart or something like that. But they'll do that and say, oh, Black Friday, it's 60% off. I'm going to go get a TV that's normally $8,000 for $3,000. But you don't have the $3,000. So you'll go and put that on a credit card. And now you have this $3,000 very nice looking TV in your home. However, that TV will never give you a return on your interest. If anything, it's a depreciating liability. Not even a depreciating asset. It's a depreciating liability, because the more time you spend watching the TV, that's the less time you're reading. That's the less time you're learning. Unless you're watching the TV to like watch documentaries or learn something or create content. If that's the case, then fantastic. But the majority of people are watching it to binge watch stuff, you know? Like even for myself, I do love watching cartoons and anime and things like that. So you can crucify me on that if you like, but I do love anime. So I don't want to actually go out and spend a lot of money or borrow, especially borrow. Like if you're going to use a product to do this, use your savings account. Use your short-term savings goal. Like, hey, I saved up so I can buy this TV, or I saved up to pay for this vacation. Don't borrow for something that's not going to help you, because then you're just going to end up struggling in that capacity. All right. Does that make sense? So we're actually going to have a second episode, because I'm going to try to keep these to about 20 minutes or so, just so that people don't lose interest. So we're going to have a second episode, and we're going to talk about investing, and then we're going to talk about protecting in that episode. So it's been fantastic. I really appreciate you guys' time. I hope that this information is helpful. I'd like to dive a lot deeper. And again, if you have questions and things like that, please leave them in the comment section below, so that I know that this is information that might be helping you and helping you get into the right location or into the right mindset to understand how the investing world is going to work, okay? All right. I'm always going to be here to try to help. And again, I wish you guys wealth, health, and happiness. I'll see you guys next week.